Good afternoon. Allison Skobik here, Consolidated Planning Group. We're excited to be back with you this afternoon to bring to you the topic by Dr. Andrea Malkin-Brenner, who is a first-year transition expert. And today we're talking to families about launching your neurodiverse teen into college. And so you are going to be wowed by her presentation today and all of her experience and knowledge. And I know that as a parent of special needs kids myself, these are questions that I have thought about. These are things that I actually had to live, eat, sleep, and breathe, and it was a lot of information. So we're certainly happy to bring that to you today. Consolidated Planning Group is a holistic financial planning firm for special needs families. We really put out a lot of webinars on a really regular basis on all things on special needs planning and special needs topics and transitioning your children into adulthood. You can check out our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded. We have a YouTube channel that you can follow. And so if you've missed some of our recordings in the past, you can go back and check them out. And we're just happy that you're here today. Today's event is being recorded. You will get an email probably tomorrow with the recording, and you'll get both of our contact information, how to reach us going forward. And should you have any questions today, we definitely just want you to put those questions in the chat box. We're going to get to as many questions as we can, and our goal, this webinar is going to run from 12 to 1. We do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So if you're planning your lunch or planning whatever you got to do between work or whatever you got going on, you can know that that is the plan for today. So having said that, Dr. Andrea, we are just glad that you're here. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm gonna stop my share, and I'm gonna turn it over to you for you to get started.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody able to see that? Allison, is that good?
I don't see it on my end yet.
Okay. All right, it's coming. Hang on. Apologies. There we go. Are we good? All right, terrific. Well, hi everybody. My name is Andrea Malkin-Brenner, and I have spent the better part of 25 years working on college campuses, most of those years at American University in Washington, D.C., where I was a college professor as well as an administrator. I also designed American University's first year experience course, and I've spent a lot of time working with college accessibility offices to make sure that every first year student's experience is equitable. And so today I'm going to talk to you about your neurodiverse teen and the launch to college. So what I'm going to cover in this webinar are three things. First, how learning support for students with neurodiversity differs pretty dramatically between K through 12 education and college. It can seem pretty overwhelming, and I am going to present quite a bit of information today. But as Allison said, this is going to be recorded. This is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording, so you don't need to take furious notes. Just kind of sit back and listen, and I'll do my best to teach you all this new information sort of slowly and calmly. The second thing we're going to talk about is the shift from high school to college, not just for the student, but for the parents as well. Sometimes a little bit of a treacherous road, so we'll talk about some of that. And third, how to begin to build your kids' skills now so that they can succeed in college later. I think there is an idea that students really need to know everything sort of last minute and before they launch to college. And I am absolutely somebody who begs to differ and to say the earlier the better. And sometime in high school, we can really start talking about that transition to college and do it slowly and calmly. A couple of things before I start. The first is that not everyone really refers to neurodiversity as a disability. And of course, that's something that is identified by the student themselves and by the family. But that said, a college student must register as a student with a disability in order to receive accommodations in college. So even though that might be a definition that doesn't necessarily feel comfortable, sit right with you or your student, that's something that you should be aware of, that a student must actually claim that status as a student with a disability in order to receive accommodations in college. And the second thing I want to mention is that the transition from high school to college can be challenging for every student. And I've worked literally with tens of thousands of freshmen. Students with neurodiversity and processing issues have an extra layer of a challenge. And one of the additional stressors is kind of the pressures that the school puts on the student to sort of do it on their own. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that change. Everything from understanding what FERPA means to how to file for accommodations in college. And again, as I said, we're going to do it slowly and calmly, and I'm happy to take questions. Okay, so let's do a little bit of background. In K through 12 education, parents are the ones who are responsible for advocating for their child's learning accommodations need. Teachers, guidance counselors, coaches, and tutors, they're often involved and they're often encouraged, especially in private schools, to provide support to the student in their family. And parents are now going to be taking a little more of a back seat, and we'll talk about that as the student transitions to college. So let's talk about some of those important differences. So I've got a lot of information up here, and I'm going to kind of slowly talk you through this. This is a quick crash course on the important terms for parents to really understand, and it differentiates what learning accommodations look like in K through 12 education in the US versus what learning accommodations look like in college. So some of these terms you probably know very well. Other of these terms might be unfamiliar to you. And again, don't feel the need to take tons of notes. I promise all of this information will be passed on. So in K through 12 education, we've got what's called the IEP. That's a term that many of you may know, the Individualized Education Program. And of course, that's developed to ensure that the K through 12 student with an identified disability receives specialized instruction, related services, and appropriate accommodations. That is a term that is used mostly in public schools, but in some private schools as well. An ISP is very similar to an IEP, and that is used mostly in private schools. That's a plan for students attending K through 12 schools, and that also explains the supports and the services that will be made available to that particular child. So if you've heard of IEP and not ISP, you've heard of ISP and not IEP, it's very similar. They have some small differences, but they're very similar. And the idea is that the K through 12 program is providing an individualized plan of access to your students. And of course, it's important to note that all up through high school, students with disabilities of any kind are primarily protected by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, which is sometimes referred to as IDEA, sometimes it's called IDEA. But the essence here is that ensures that all children receive a free and appropriate education that's designed to meet every student's specific needs. And the important thing about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is that the legal and the financial burden of that care falls on the school system, not on the individual family. A lot of parents are surprised that IDEA or IDEA does not carry over to college. It really is not a college entity. Colleges, of course, must comply with laws that I'm going to mention in a minute, but they are different than the K through 12 laws. And finally, under K through 12 education is the 504 plan. I'm sure some of you on this call are familiar with the 504 plan. And that's sort of what we refer to as a blueprint for how a school will provide that support. So you have the IEP or the ISP, and then the 504 plan is the blueprint for how the school will remove those barriers for the student with a disability to learn equitably. Once the student moves to college, they are dealing with something completely different, still protected by law, but by different laws. And in fact, the college student is protected by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's a civil rights law. And it protects individuals basically from discrimination. So in a nutshell, college students have civil rights, but they have different and really not the same educational rights that they did in K through 12. So in so many words, K through 12 education focuses on, you see the words in black there, success, the success of a student, and college education is based on access. Doesn't mean we're not looking for college students to succeed. It just means that the effort is being put on their legal action, and that would include access to education and other programs. Another thing that surprised some parents that I work with is that the ADA also protects students at the college level, not just in accessibility, but in their classroom, but also in things like the cafeteria, any kind of extracurricular or co-curricular activities that go through that go through student activities office on college campuses. They take a really, really important role in that. So last, we're going to talk about reasonable accommodations. And that's a term that a lot of people have not heard of until they are college bound or are starting to meet with disability services offices. It's kind of a lousy sounding term, but it does some real good. And that's a term used by colleges that focuses on how the student daily life can sort of be held by the modifications that the school will make on their programs, their policies, and their practices. And that's, of course, only for eligible students, those who are officially receiving accommodations in college. And this affords them, the reasonable accommodations affords them equal opportunity to benefit from the classroom. So that can be anything from a ramp for a wheelchair to a large print edition, to extra time on tests, to whatever that student's needed accommodations will be, as long as they're considered reasonable by the college. So in summary, college academic support offices work directly with students. And I'm going to emphasize they don't work with parents. They work directly with the young adults who will be attending that college, and only those who have documented disabilities, to provide what they call reasonable accommodations. However, unlike in K through 12, students, not the parents, not the teachers or the school, are required by law to drive the process themselves and to pursue accommodations. And that's really the heart of my talk today, because I want, wherever your student is, middle school or high school, I want you to start thinking about turning that role over to the student, because they need to step up and they're the one that the school will be talking to. So this might sound overwhelming. It might sound even a little daunting, but keep in mind your student is not going through this alone. The accommodations office at the college that they will be attending will walk with them and help them through the process. There are specialists in those offices that deal with first-year students specifically, those who deal with transfer students specifically, and they really know what they're talking about when it comes to helping students get their accommodations that they need. So another thing that can be quite annoying to families is that every college has a unique process to assess students' needs and provide them with what's called reasonable accommodations. And that can be really, really overwhelming. So one thing I would absolutely suggest early on is, as you and your students are looking at colleges, wherever you are in that process, I would include the Learning Studies office or accommodations office. And of course, one of the things that drives people nuts is that it's called something different at every school. But every school will have some sort of learning or accommodations office online, and you can check that out in advance. And I encourage you very, very strongly to go ahead and do that. Let's move on. So I want to talk.
We actually had a quick question about it. If a parent has guardianship, and I think you're actually going to, oh, it's right here, the FERPA. Someone was asking if a parent has guardianship, could they be more involved in the process with the Office of Disability? But I'm going to let you roll on this slide, because this is the important one.
Absolutely. So let me talk about this, and if I don't answer the question in the slide, I'm happy to return to it. So there is something called FERPA, F-E-R-P-A, and that's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And if you are not familiar with college lingo, this is something that's going to come up in a lot of your conversations about receiving accommodation or student receiving accommodations in college. So FERPA is a federal law, and it protects the privacy of all student records when the child reaches 18 or attends school beyond the high school level, even if they're under 18. So it might be a 17-year-old who's starting college. I always get the question about what about high school students enrolled in college courses? If they are primarily a high school student, FERPA does not apply. It is only when they become officially, or when they are officially out of high school, no matter what their age is, and they're enrolled in a college, that this would apply. So here's the important thing about FERPA. It's a conversation to have as you learn about it today and do research on your own. It's a conversation that you need to have as a family. There's not something prescriptive that I would even suggest. I don't deem to know everybody's family story. But it's something that you might want to talk to teachers or tutors, high school specialists, anyone working with your student in any way, as well as the disability support office in the colleges they're looking at. So how does FERPA work? Well, unless the student signs a waiver, and the student does have to sign that waiver, FERPA prohibits the college from providing parents and guardians with 6 things. And I'm going to mention all of them, and then I'm going to come back to the one with asterisks. So what this means is if your student does not sign a waiver, you will not have automatic access to any of these things. Matter of fact, you won't be able to have access unless there's an emergency to any of these things without the student signing. Number 1 is grades. So you may be able to go into a portal and see your students' grades. You might be getting a grade record or a report card in the mail, or by email when they are K through 12. That won't happen in college. Grades are only a conversation between the school and the student. Doesn't matter who's paying. That is a conversation between the school and the student. Learning accommodations, any kind of accommodations, is something else. So you won't even have a record of the accommodations that have been granted to your student. That is also a communication between the school and the student. Their academic progress. As a parent, if you do not have your student sign the FERPA waiver, you will not know if your student is on any kind of academic probation, as it says a little bit later here, and any kind of academic progress. So you won't know if your student is receiving an A or a C in a particular class at any particular time. I'm going to reference tuition notifications in a second and jump ahead to scholarship information. That's something that also surprises a lot of families. All of that communication between the school and about scholarship information is between the school and the student, not the parent. I have an asterisk next to tuition notifications because for many years, FERPA included tuition notifications, and legally it still does. But what most colleges in the US have now done is afforded an easier waiver because many parents don't expect their student to sign the FERPA waiver, but they of course expect to have access to the bill that they might be paying. So schools now make it extremely easy for tuition notification to come to both the student and the parent. But even though we've made it easier and easier, FERPA still prohibits it without the student granting access. Usually the student has no problem with their parents having access to their bills. So question I get asked often is it a good idea for your particular student to sign the waiver? Is it something that you should encourage happening? And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a conversation to have. It's not prescriptive. It's not something I would suggest, but it's something I want you to think about carefully because remember that this is an important time and FERPA is an important step towards adulthood. And colleges view your student as a young adult and are going to expect them to act as such. So, for example, I have a son who's currently in college. And although my husband and I did not make him sign a FERPA waiver, we do pay for his college and we expect to see his grades. So that's an understanding that we have in our family that's not non-negotiable, that those grades need to be coming to us. I can ask at any point in time how he's doing. And of course, he can talk to us if he's struggling at all. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to have your student sign the FERPA waiver for year 1 and then cancel that waiver for the years beyond. So there's many ways to work on this with your student. I would say the big question to ask is your student ready for college? And if they are, can they be counted on to actually take care of these communications. And sometimes these communications are things that they just forward on to your email. But a lot of times this is a question I get, and it's something that's really, really important to talk about as a family. So the next thing I want to talk about are defining roles. And this is something that can drive a lot of parents nuts. The college and the students' roles are extremely well defined. If you look at the college mission, you'll usually see something like the college acts in loco parentis, meaning in the role of the parent. They have a mission where they educate, advance knowledge, foster intellectual curiosity, build leaders of the future. All of that language is in most schools' missions. So the role of the college and their role as working with students is very, very well defined. This college's mission also defines the role of the student. The role of the student is an independent scholar, an adult member of a community, perhaps a caring peer. Depending on the position of the college, if it's a religious institution or not, it's going to look a little different. But regardless, the defining role for the student is very clear. The defining role for the parent is unclear in most colleges. And it's a really tough role for a lot of parents, and especially parents of kids with neurodiversity, because it's not well defined. What is our role? We had played the role of advocate for our kids for so long. We were the #1 advocate for our students. And now we're sort of put in the back burner because of FERPA, because our students are now legal adults. It can be really frustrating for parents who sort of feel kicked out of the process. And again, this isn't just academics, it's all elements of the college process, the college experience, living in a dorm, getting along with others, managing their schedules, keeping up with their academics, of course, seeking needed accommodations. So that's a role that's tricky. I think it's worth mentioning. And it's a conversation that parents and students should have. What is my role going to be? And when are you going to need help? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this as we move on. So this is a chart that many of you probably haven't seen for a while, if ever. And indeed, it is a chart that talks about the weaning process from breastfeeding to eventual replacement of breast milk with solid food. So I haven't lost my mind, but I love to show this chart to parents because this slow introduction of weaning, right? Weaning off of nursing and on to eventually whole milk and solid foods is something that happens with most children. And the process is actually a gradual one. And I think that there's a misunderstanding that students are going to need to go from dependent to independent overnight when they get their college acceptance letter. And in fact, that is not the case. There is a very gradual process of moving from dependence to independence, just as we did with our children when they were babies and they were learning to eat. Keep in mind that in adolescence, the time moving from middle school to high school and then throughout high school, we should, as parents, should expect to see more initiative and investment regarding duties and obligations on the daily in the house. And that's something that we can expect as parents. However, most parents have a tough time not in all areas, but in many areas, letting go of this oversight altogether. And I'm not encouraging letting go of the oversight altogether. But keep in mind that it is a disservice to our students as they head off to college if we throw everything back at them at once. So the gradual idea of weaning our students off of our caretaking, and that could be things as simple as making your own dentist appointment. Every college-bound student should be able to do that. Making your own lunch for school, remembering your soccer jersey. These are all things that by the time those students are in 10th, 11th, 12th grade, certainly, we shouldn't even be having to remind them. They should know on their own. And if they do need reminders, think of ways that they can be reminded that's not the parent waking them up and doing that, because you won't have that in college. So when you think about becoming the parent of a college student, for those of you transitioning to that in the future, think about this chart. And I would encourage you to think about lessening your involvement with your child's everyday reminders and life, and simultaneously increase your support of that student finding resources on their own. So that's not that's not stepping back and expecting your student to take over completely on their own, but stepping back and encouraging your student to find that support on campus. So that might be a counseling center, a wellness center, a disability support center. There is so much support and so many resources on a college campus. And that's something that you'll be learning about. So I'm going to talk next about the important transition from high school parent to college parent. And if you think about the high school parent as sort of co-piloting, I love to think about the college parent as sort of the college parent sitting in the back seat and encouraging that student to drive very slowly at first, but eventually with more and more comfort. So the high school parent often organizes for the student. And as we move from high school parent to college parent, we're moving to the role of from organizer to supporter so that the student can become their own organizer. Fixer is something that high school parents are used to doing. We fix things as we did from when our kids were little. And we love to see college parents moving into the role of encourager for the student to fix their own mistakes. And I'll talk about exactly how to do that in a little bit. A high school parent often removes obstacles. We've heard of snowplow parenting, right? The idea that we plow ahead and so our kid faces no obstacles. But of course, that's not realistic adulting. And so the college parent should really let the student traverse obstacles on their own and help them as they move along. The reminders of daily life of the high school parent, if we can step back and let the student try to do at least what they can handle on their own. And then, of course, the college parent eventually will rarely remind the student of anything. The high school parent frequently reiterates expectations. I can hear myself repeating with my high school student. But the college parent helps the child set their own expectations. So again, I want to emphasize that we do not need to go from dependent to independent overnight. We can't expect that of our students. But hidden behind those arrows, moving from the role of high school parent to college parent, are sort of those lessons, the teaching and learning process. And that's something that we can start as early as 9th or 10th grade and slowly let things go, slowly teach our students how to take, our kids how to take on things on their own. So as I mentioned, preparing now for the transition to college really involves teaching and facilitating independent problem solving. And of course, if you look at any chart online, it all seems that the hardest thing to do when you go to college is to learn how to do laundry. I'll say a couple things about that. First of all, I sure hope that high school students have already learned how to do laundry. If not, that's something that you can teach them this coming weekend. But more importantly, there are different parts of that independent problem solving that aren't as simple as learning to do laundry. And students with processing issues or students with neurodiversity often struggle with the multi-part steps. And so that's something that we can chunk, just like the way we would chunk academic work. And that's something that we can start and expect different pieces each year for our student to be able to handle. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Excuse me. Another thing that's really important, and this is a chart you may not have seen before, but again, I'm going to throw it back on the student because the college expects the student to be the one seeking accommodations. So the student seeking accommodations in college must be able to do these 7 things. First, they must be able to ask the Academic Support Office or Disability Studies Office the following questions. They have to ask about the documentation needed to pursue accommodation. So that shouldn't be a call from the parent to that office. It should be a call from the student to that office. What type of documentation do you, Learning Disabilities Office, need from me, student, in order for me to pursue my accommodations in college? And it will be a list, and usually that list is online and something you can find right away. Another question the student should be able to or should ask is if medical or neuropsych documentation is required. And the answer usually is yes, but it differs widely based on the college. Some colleges will allow that high school documentation to stand for all 4 years of college. Some will allow it just for the first year of college. Some require that documentation to be updated within 5 years, some within 3. I've even seen some within 2 years. And it's not necessarily that they are being nitpicky. It's that it's important that the neuropsych or medical documentation is viewed through the lens of an adult, because again, the college is college is thinking about your student as an adult, a young adult, but an adult nonetheless. And many of our kids have that medical or neuropsych documentation from their adolescence. And so a lot of times they need to be it needs to be redocumented before the student goes to college. So that's something you'll want to know in advance. And third, the student should be able to ask about the deadlines for that documentation. That's really important and differs from school to school. Also, if applicable, and not all of these will apply to your student, the student should be able to clearly explain their specific disability and the associated challenges. I like to refer to this as their elevator speech. If they felt they wanted to disclose to someone about their disability, what would they say? What is that language? What is that tight little elevator speech, 1 minute elevator speech? And that's something that you can help them craft. Again, not asking them to disclose outside of the disabilities office, but that's something that they really, really will need to know. Yes, go ahead.
Can I add in here? One of the things that we have found on the accommodations lately in the college landscape is that it is ever changing as far as the testing requirements, especially due to COVID and people having the inability to get testing. So one thing that you may want to ask about, because it might save you $3,000 to $5,000, is ask them. So let's say your kid has a permanent disability that there's relatively no change. So the neuropsych testing was done when they were 12 years old, but there's basically no change. You could ask them if you have the old neuropsych testing along with a supporting letter from your physician, which would be free for you to get usually, if they'll accept that. And a lot of schools definitely will. And then the other thing that I want to say about this that's super important is if you haven't had testing in a long time, some of the places that do testing are months behind of actually scheduling an appointment. And then sometimes once you have the appointment, it could be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to 3 or 4 months before you actually get the report. So I cannot say enough to start early on this process. It really, really does matter, because you actually, if you don't have this, you could be sending your child into the university with both hands behind their back because they simply can't get the accommodation. So we've just seen this a lot, and I just wanted to just echo some of the things I've seen since the pandemic.
No, Alice, I think those are great points, and thank you for mentioning them. We're seeing more and more schools with provisional acceptances of documentation, meaning we know there's a wait because of COVID, and we will accept something that we wouldn't normally accept temporarily, so your student can get accommodations right away, but you'll need them by X date. So I think that's really worthy of noting. Thank you very much. Back to what your student should be able to clearly explain, in addition to that elevator speech, is the accommodations they received in high school. That is a frequent question that students will receive from a disability studies office. What accommodations, student, did you receive in high school? And the student really needs to be able to understand what they got and why they got that. So if you were granted, for example, your student was granted time and a half on tests, why? What's the reasoning for that? What's the thought process? Students should also be able to talk about the assumed college accommodation needs. And that's a conversation I would expect you as parents, we should all be having with our students with special needs, because that's not something that can live sort of on the student's shoulders. They may, of course, they have less an idea than we do about what a college classroom is like. And so they may say something like something related to either middle school thought processes, where it's really important for us to be explaining to them, for example, how few hours they're actually going to be in class in college versus what they were in high school, or how much more reading there is in college than there was in high school. So these are some of the differences that are really important for the student to know as they talk about and think about the accommodations that they'll need. And the last one, of course, only if applicable, is the student should be able to clearly explain all of the information on their medications that they're taking, why they take the medications they take, how frequently they take them, and what will happen if they do not take those medications. So those are really important things for parents to talk to their kids about while they're in high school, so when they head off to college, they'll be able to have those conversations. So taking inventory is another really important piece of the pie here. Think about these questions. What does your teen already do well independently? How does their neurodivergent identity create more challenges, if it does? What are the areas in which you as a parent still frequently step into, quote, rescue your teen? And what are ways you can let them, quote, fail safely? And I want to put fail in quotes because, of course, not every story is the same. And no matter how old our children are, when it comes to health and safety, that's a place where we really need to be careful, of course. But are there places, if you look at the third bullet point here, where you still frequently step in to rescue your teen? We don't really need to do that. And I was just doing a parenting workshop recently, and a parent brought up a great example of this I want to bring up. And that is, I knew my student printed out a hard copy of their paper to turn in to their teacher, and I knew they had left it in the printer. And it was up to me, and this particular parent had a junior in high school who was going to be college ready in supposedly in 2 years. And she said, you know what? I looked at that paper in the printer and I thought, should I run it over to school? And indeed, she decided not to. And she got a frantic text from the student saying, please run it over, please run it over. And the parent held back and she said, you know what, I'm not available, even though she actually was available at the time. But that let the opportunity for the student to approach the teacher to say, I made a mistake, I did print it out, it's in the printer. Can I come in early tomorrow, or whatever accommodations they would work out with the teacher. And maybe it was a point off the final grade, maybe it was a negotiation with the teacher, but it was a great way for that student to step up and learn to adult. So those are what I mean by the last bullet of ways that you can let them fail safely. Not talking about not showing up for a medical appointment. I'm talking about ways that they can actually fail and learn from the experience. And again, when we rescue our students in everything, our students expect us to continue to rescue them. So I want you to think really hard, and maybe it's a conversation you want to have with your high school students. What are ways that we can step back, and what are ways that we can let you work on your own? So I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk a little bit about how to do this. And the best idea that I can do is if you can have a conversation with your student and encourage them to shift from asking what they should do to coming up with different language. And so here's some of my favorite language. If a student comes to college and they have a problem, maybe it's a common problem. For example, they are trying to register for a core class that they know they need, but there's no spots left at a time that works for their schedule. And they go to their academic advisor's office, which is the appropriate resource. And they walk in there and they frantically say, I have a problem, what should I do? Well, what's going to happen on a college campus? That academic advisor is going to turn to this young adult and say, well, that does seem like a problem. What do you think you should do? Not, here's what you should do, here's the solution. So in order to prepare students for those adult conversations, very business-like professional conversations that will be happening on a college campus, I encourage you as early as you can, that's appropriate for your student, to shift from telling your teen what to do, even if it's easiest, to asking them what they think they should do. So if they come into the room and they say, I'm freaked out, I have a problem, what should I do? You know, as a parent, it's super easy for me to say, here's what you should do, because you know what, I know, I'm the adult, I've seen those problems before. But if you can flip the script and you can say, that does sound like a problem. What do you think you should do? And let them be the ones to lead the conversation. That's going to really help them as they develop into that young adult. Self-advocacy doesn't mean knowing everything. And this is something I love talking about. I talk about it in my book, which I'll mention in a little bit. But I love talking to parents about, and that's the idea that if you sit down with a bunch of parents and you sit down with a bunch of high school kids in two different areas, two different focus groups, and you say to the high school kids without the parents present, what does adulting mean? What does it mean to be an adult? Well, those high school kids will say one of two things, usually. Either, I have no idea, it's a mystery to me, like in the picture there, or they'll say, it means doing it on my own. It means doing it all on my own, and I got to figure out how to do it on my own. However, if you sit down and you talk to a bunch of parents about what does it mean to be an adult, or what does adulting mean, they're actually going to think about what they do to make the decisions in their life, who they reach out to if they're in a crisis or they need help. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, and I know many of you listening today, if you have a problem, if there's a death in the family or a health crisis in the family, the first thing we do is we reach out for answers, right? We reach out to experts. We look at our resources around us. We might reach out to friends and family to help support us, anything from bringing over dinners to giving us emotional support. And that is actually a part of adulting, is knowing the resources. And if we can rethink the way we talk to our teens and explain to them that adulting actually doesn't mean doing it alone, but it means knowing how to get information, knowing who to ask for help and how to ask for help, that's really very powerful. And it's something that will afford them wonderful opportunities on a college campus where tons of resources are at their fingertips. So again, I want to say we really need to retrain our teens to think about adulting and really think about it how it looks through an adult brain, not how it looks through a kid's brain. So here are some prompting questions related to what I just mentioned, but sort of through the lens of parenting neurodiverse kids. So here are some prompting questions from parent to student. What do you know about your IEP or your 504 plan? Without giving them information, ask them what they know, see where they are, maybe ask follow-up questions. What do you think are your strengths as a student? So, a lot of times we talk about failure, we talk about how we can make up the difference, but let's ask the questions about what their strengths are. Then we can flip it and say, what's hardest for you? Okay, again, noticing I'm not saying what are your weaknesses, but what's hardest for you? And then finally, and maybe most important, what accommodations do you currently receive in the classroom and what helps you most? And those are they're related questions, but sometimes you'll get different answers from them. And then I would use the opportunity, and that opportunity is still high school, even the summer before college, to fill in any gaps in your child's knowledge with all 4 of these bullet points. Sit down and look at their IEP together, and if appropriate, have them attend their IEP meetings so they can actually understand what the thought process is as people are making accommodations for their learning needs. I would also say, help your high school student help themselves by encouraging them to talk to teachers, encouraging them to ask for help, encouraging them to call for information. So for example, you're looking at colleges with your student and you both have a question about something at the college, right? Whatever it might be, ask them to call for information. Step back a little, have them look online and find the answers to their questions. Researching things, researching ideas, wonderful way to start encouraging them. And of course, brainstorming solutions. This is a problem. How do you think you should go about it? I would say role playing beforehand, especially with kids with neurodiversity, is great. So a lot of them have trouble the first time. And I would say speakerphone is one of the best ways to do this. So I've worked with many, many parents who've said, my kids got such processing issues. I don't even know if they could make their own dentist appointment. You're telling me that they should, but I don't even know if they could. And so again, I'm not saying go from dependence to independence overnight. What I'm suggesting is have them sit next to you while you're on speakerphone, making a dentist appointment for them, or a haircut appointment, or an orthodontist appointment, or whatever appointment it is. There are lots of them before college. Have them listen to that interaction. They don't have to say anything. They're just an observer. And then the next time they're on speakerphone, they're making the appointment and you're sitting next to them. You're listening. Maybe you're suggesting things to them. You can even speak up if it doesn't embarrass them. And then by the 3rd appointment, maybe that's the dentist or the haircut or the doctor or the eye doctor. That's a conversation that they can usually have on their own without you on speakerphone. So a slow and gradual process, just like that weaning slide. And the idea is not to throw them to the wolves overnight, but encourage them slowly to learn how to do these things on their own. And so that's it for me. I wanted to tell you a little bit in that, as I mentioned, I worked on college campuses for 25 years. I'm co-author of a book called How to College, What to Know Before You Go and When You're There. It's on Amazon if you're interested in purchasing it. And it's a student-facing book all about transitioning from high school to college. There are very few student-facing books. And it has activities that you can do with your students before they head off to college. Has a lots in there for students with neurodiversity, but it is a general book for all students. And then one of the things that I love to do, because I do work, as I mentioned earlier, with parents in workshops all the time, is at the end of every workshop, I always have students, parents, excuse me, that come up to me and say, what do I need to talk to my kids about? What are those important conversations? And so what COVID afforded me was the opportunity to create something, and you're actually the first group that's seeing it. This is just a sample of it, but it's the Talking College card deck, and these are cards, and it's a double pack of playing cards, and they're the most important conversations to have with your students before college. Just like I mentioned earlier, they're not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how much to give your kids in, how much money to give your kids every month. But it talks about all of the money matters that you're going to need to discuss. There are 11 themes in the cards, and those will soon be available on Amazon. And I'm thrilled to kind of bring them to the public. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
I am not seeing any questions at this time. We did have one question in the chat box that I've kind of been corresponding with about does the school or the college do the testing? Like, so let's just say you haven't had testing. What is your experience with that?
My experience is that most do not do the testing at the university. There are exceptions to that, but it's pretty standard. They are expecting you to come in with that.
Because a lot of our participants here today are from Texas, it is important to note that there are some ways that you could get testing through the state of Texas. One is through your local intellectual disability authority, which is by your county. So for instance, I think we've got people from all over the state, and I certainly don't know everybody off of the top of my head, but for instance, the Harris Center, which used to be MHMRA in Houston, Texana is Fort Bend County. That is your local intellectual disability authority. That is one place that you can check. Another place that we actually have seen people get testing, and again, some of this neuropsych testing and some of the testing that is needed, or learning disability testing and stuff like that, is relatively expensive and sometimes not covered by insurance. And most of the time not covered by insurance is the fact, actually. But Texas also has through the Texas Workforce Commissions, there is a vocational rehab program for kids that want to find gainful employment, that have an impediment to employment, so basically a disability. And it's from ages like 14, I want to say 14 to 19, but I know it starts at 14. And we actually do have a presentation on our YouTube channel about that. But part of what the vocation, so what you don't call is say, I heard you do testing and I want you guys to do this. But if the child actually wants to go to work and wants to find gainful employment, and it could be post-college, it doesn't have to be right away, they're going to try to fill in the gaps of what the deficit to gainful employment is, right? And so how they determine that is usually through testing. It could be neuropsych testing. That could be an example of one of them. And it could also be a vocational evaluation that would also show some of those deficits necessary. So those are just some things that you can put on your radar. You can check on your Texas schools. They have a vocational rehab counselor. So your transition counselor at your school will be able to connect you to your vocational rehab Texas Workforce Commission contact. We have some contacts as well, but those are some things that I think that you could end up having that testing covered for free.
Yeah, and okay, Allison, if it's okay, I just add one more thing. Thank you for that Texas specific information. Across the country, there are smaller liberal arts schools that have wonderful learning studies offices, learning disability support, that do have pots of money for scholarship specifically for testing. So that's something that's worth looking at. I know that Allison and I feel the same way. Check out these schools well in advance. And that really should be part of your introduction to any school, either in person on a tour, or online, is figuring out what that learning studies office looks like, how your students' needs will be met there, et cetera. And that's a question you can certainly ask.
One question that we have is, do you recommend community colleges for students with special abilities? And one thing that I would say as a parent that kind of went down this highway was sometimes it's a nice first step. Maybe they're not ready for the university and they do have accommodations on the community college, but what's nice about it is if you have a child that doesn't test well, the ACT or the SAT, the community college is a way in Texas that you can go through and just simply do the TSI and not ever have a requirement of the SAT or the ACT. So I think, you know, for kids that have test anxiety or they simply just score bad, that was one of the, you know, things that I think that can be helpful. What do you think about the community college?
You taken the words right out of my mouth. Absolutely, I would agree wholeheartedly. It's a wonderful introduction to college. The only drawback to that is for the student who is actually has a disability, documented disability, but their issue are the social skills, not the academic skills. It sometimes delays the process because, and many community colleges, students living at home and attending classes. So they're getting that academic transition, but they still are going to have to move into living with a roommate, waking up on their own, eating on their own, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So again, there's not one monolithic, it's not prescriptive, but it's a great way to slowly transition in if that's something that your student needs. I would look in advance to see if the colleges, the four-year colleges, if that's in the cards for them, will accept community college credits. I know a lot of students get stuck kind of in that situation where they've had a wonderful introduction, some great experience at the college, at the community college, but then they choose a college that doesn't accept those credits and they've wasted the time and money that way. So lots of different stories, but I would absolutely encourage people to take a look at it because it's a wonderful entree, especially academically.
Good there. We had one question asking if this recording was going to be shared, and it'll probably be tomorrow. And then I'm going to put the information in the chat box on the state of Texas, but I'll just repeat it again too for your own benefit. You can look up your local intellectual disability authority, LIDDA. You can look that up online. And see what it is for your county. So that may be one area. They may have some testing available. They may or may not. You've got to call, and they have individualized services. So every case is different. I don't get to pick or anything like that. But that's one area. And then the other one is the Texas Workforce Commission Vocational Rehab Program. And they have a great website, and you can check all of that out there as well. So do you have some additional things that you'd like to share in conclusion?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Well, let me get this in the chat box. And okay, so I said Texas Workforce Commission Vocational Rehab. And I think that we have some transition coordinators on here today, like from some of the school systems and stuff like that. Again, they're good at pointing you to some of these resources. So reach out to them. They know a lot. They know a lot of people, and they also know challenges of testing and things like that. That it expense. I mean, usually the challenge is the large expense of $3,500 to $5,000 for some of this testing, but they may have some additional resources for you that you hadn't thought about as well. So can you put your contact information on the screen? And also, so when we send this email today with the recording, well, you'll have my contact information, we'll have her contact information, and the cards that she was mentioning are not available yet, but they will be soon. And so we'll get that out to you. She'll get that out to you when they are available. So if that's something that you, if you want to take a look at that, and it can be helpful. And where can they find your book? Tell them again where they can find your book, please.
You can find my book on Amazon, on my website below there, anywhere. It's pulled everywhere. And if anybody would like to have any follow-up conversations, simply send me an email through my website. I'm happy to talk to anybody.
Awesome. Well, that is, thank you again for taking your time to be with us here today. And I love your passion, and it's so true. I would say, as a mom, when I went through this, I felt like a madwoman. I'm just telling you, it was like so much, because like you hit on in the beginning, all these schools are created differently. They have different sets of rules, different timelines. Everything is a little bit different. And it would have been a lot easier if there would have been a website that just had all of this on there, and quick, fast, in a hurry that I could see this. But it simply just doesn't work like that. And so knowing that ahead of time is going to make this this period and your choices a little bit better, because you have a little bit more time to work on this. And I think that is the biggest message that I say all the time, is start early. You know, we start in these freshman year and we think, oh, I got 4 years, but it blows by. It absolutely blows by, and it is just, it's insane. And the thing is this level of information is, like, most of the time no match for our kids, because it's so convoluted and complicated. So parent involvement is so necessary in this stage. And then also, even the guidance counselors that are like college guidance counselors at your school, they're really good and they're really smart, but they're one person managing the whole school, usually only one per school, and sometimes they cover more than one school. So the notion that the college specialist at your public school is going to help make all of these decisions and do all of this legwork and timeline, they simply don't have enough hours in the day. They're really smart and they're really good at what they do, but there's just simply not enough hours in the day to do all this kind of work for every single student. So anyway, well, we're just, like I said, we're super glad that you shared your information with us today, and we'll hope you'll join us again sometime soon. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye now.